Well, thanks for coming out today, especially on this gorgeous and wonderful day. For me, what I'm hoping to do is provide a little bit of a context. Anybody here belong to a congregation, a church? This is kind of geared in that kind of way. This first presentation this morning, Mary asked me to do this because of how our congregation has or has not been involved in some things we should have been about. So I wanted to give a context and maybe something helpful for people in congregations today. It's been billed for our wider ELCA Lutheran Church, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and we will videotape some of this and then make that available to our congregations and churches as well. We've opened our congregation's life and facilities to events like this because we have learned that our silence or inattentiveness, even done so as not to embarrass a person or a family, can exacerbate misunderstandings and lead to mistakes that can give the impression that we as congregations are not interested or don't care about the crisis today. And I'd like to give some context today, and in that context, even a confession. As much as we in the church community like to be purveyors of goodness and grace and gladness, sometimes congregations and churches can unwittingly and unknowingly find their heads covered, their ears plugged, and mouths closed, and miss important opportunities. And I think that's what happened to us. And it's not because of a lack of interest or a lack of concern. It's more that we, like other people, friends and neighbors and groups, just don't always know what to do, especially when we might have preconceived notions and stereotypes that impact us daily. Many like to think, and I know I run up against this routinely, that the use of drugs and that mental illness is something that's out there somewhere in the streets, in the dark corners, with people who have given up on themselves, so it's quite easy even for churches to have given up on them. We don't like to believe that these diseases are at all part of our personal communities, and we don't want them to be, quite frankly. We almost like to think that it's only the unsavory dregs of society who have these kinds of concerns or problems, so we distance ourselves somewhat stereotypically, believing that they're different somehow. Congregations and many different denominations like to think of themselves in some ways as saving people from themselves, but I've come to conclude that maybe congregations, and even ours for a particular point, needed to be saved from itself. People utter kinds of things under their breath that these people out there are not the kind of people we want or need. We maybe even think, what if we catch it? So what we do in churches, we relegate a certain time of day, a certain room in the building, and say, if you'd like to come and use it, you may. No smoking, all of the little stipulations about how the building is going to be used, and probably for some good reasons as well. But even to make those kinds of stipulations is kind of helping us to distance ourselves. And I think we need to realize that as churches today. What we have discovered is that those kinds of people are actually right here in our chairs or pews, depending on your congregation, sitting right beside us sometimes, hiding for fear they might even be found out, but believing perhaps by some kind of miracle, a miracle of God, that maybe if they sit in these chairs long enough, or maybe just long enough, that there might be some sense of salvation or a miracle that does happen. The fact of it is, and we have to become aware of this more and more, that we are even already associating with these kinds of people. Some are looking for us for help. They're looking for God. And sometimes in our congregations, we're a bit too careful and cautious to respond without offering some spiritual platitudes or words of advice that merely helps us continue to keep our distance. I discovered over a period of a couple of years, though, this was not part of us, or so it seemed. And it was very easy then to isolate ourselves from what we have come to believe is somebody else's problem. I'm embarrassed about that, for me as a pastor and also for us as a congregation. I'm embarrassed to admit my fear, my anxiety, and perhaps even, though I wouldn't have said it then, but as I reflect on it, maybe I would say it now, my lack of compassion and even love. Unfortunately, or maybe even fortunately, it's only after the fact that most of us might understand this about ourselves. And it's then that shame creeps in to challenge our prior sense of self-assurance. It was only a couple of years ago that I officiated a funeral of a young man in his early 20s who had struggled with both emotional illness and chemical dependency in order to feel something other than what seemed to be taking his dignity, his well-being, and his life away. Evidently, the prescriptive drugs that he'd been using, then taking, maybe for better health for himself, as he reflected, caused him to feel other than being himself and who he knew he should be. Non-prescriptive drugs were available, and they helped him not so much to feel normal, but to feel much of the time like he was simply okay for the moment, even though deep down inside he knew he wasn't. It was a numbing agent, and he grew accustomed to and dependent upon it to rid himself of some internal terror which he couldn't explain and from which he could also not escape. At the same time, in the midst of his struggle, he had found a community, or maybe perhaps a community found him that was supportive of him. They reassured him, they gave him a place of belonging. They were his friends who stood beside him and obviously understood, maybe even firsthand, his pain, his grief, and his internal torment. They didn't give up on him. They encouraged him. They partied with him. They fed him that which was, in a sense, supposed to soothe in order to help him feel some sense of normalcy in the midst of a world breaking down. At least, unlike others, maybe even ourselves, they were there for him. Unfortunately, and in truth, the comradeship that was provided by these so-called friends, who might have been feeling much the same internal torture, actually killed him because of their mutual drug dependence. As I reflected on the community that surrounded this young man at that particular time with their kinds of support, albeit destructive kind, I wondered if there isn't actually some kind of sustenance both for him and for his family as well that our congregation should have been providing, filling a void that we weren't sure about, a need, filling a life. And that's why my hope today was that maybe other church communities would be here so that we could think about it just a little bit more and maybe stand beside someone in their pain and their anguish and distress, even if it's mental illness or drugs, to bring some kind of hope or healing. After all, when I think about it, we're pretty good at other things, other kinds of circumstances in life where people are hurting, end-of-life kinds of things, illness kind of things. But what is it about this that scares us? Why would we give up a person to those who would destroy life rather than to employ the practices and principles that give light back and actually as congregations should be pretty doggone good at? But unfortunately, we're most uncomfortable, and we don't know what to do with our discomfort. So many insulate themselves, even maybe making themselves somewhat numb, abandoning maybe families and friends, and just maybe uttering simple words in passing from time to time that say, "How are things going?" And it seems good enough, but I know now it's not. We would listen, even though some parts of the story were told. It had to be clear in our listening that we didn't want to hear anymore. Why? Because honestly, we felt powerless. We didn't know what to do or how to fix it. And a sense of helplessness in this congregation held us back. And that's embarrassing. The family of this young man was also aware that to say more just brought discomfort to the conversation and then to themselves, so perhaps even less was said. And we would walk away from each other with an almost superficial exchange and then a feeling of relief, knowing that we did our job of feeling sorry for without honestly stepping into any place of compassion or hope or help. And while the immediate burden was released, we all knew in our hearts that it was only growing deeper. Everyone seemed to step away so as to avoid the awkwardness. And even in the midst of our religious community, with all of the worship and the praise and the celebration ritualistically and spiritually happening, a family felt abandoned to their fate to go it alone. And maybe even, and I don't know this for sure, maybe even feeling abandoned sometimes by God. And then came the young man's death. Hey, now we know what to do. We're good at this. And so the congregation leaped into action and provided the best kind of funeral, a celebration, a meal that was entirely possible. We could do this because we knew what to do and how to do it. We'd done it many, many, many times before, and actually we're quite good at it. There were few questions to be asked, a lot of work to be done, and we lost ourselves in the busyness. And yet through it all, there was a dark shadow that hung above us. And it's because of this experience, and I read this today because I want to say it precisely. This isn't my normal style, so it feels a little bit uncomfortable, but it's because of this experience today that I, as a pastor, realized that there was so much I didn't know, didn't do, and maybe even inadvertently contributed, both as a pastor and then wider as a congregation, to this young man's and to this family's struggle. We realized later that we were only standing beside this family, but we were not standing with this family. It's a simple difference between simple concern and true compassion. It was our fear, our lack of knowledge, and being too busy talking than being willing to listen and ask the right questions that left a young man and his family maybe with a growing sense of emptiness and helplessness. And it just might be that a confession like this is something that many in our spiritual communities, neighborhoods, and local communities as well need to do. Because what we've realized is the disease is not on the other side of the tracks. It's right here in our own backyards, in our homes, in our churches, and with the neighbors whose shades are pulled down tight right across the street. So I turned then to something I knew. And for myself, and even to a certain degree for our congregation, put it into practice. There was a need. In the church world, there's a spiritual concept called penitence. It's often, unfortunately, misunderstood a lot because when it's misunderstood, it's used with short-sightedness and in manipulative kinds of ways. But I found that the concept in its purity, when put into sincere practice, can be helpful for individuals and for a group as well. So we did. We put it into practice. Penitence doesn't provide an excuse for an inattentiveness and failure. Instead, it provides a pathway to a new kind of wholeness, outlook, and attitude. It helps people to move forward to something we call redemption. I'll talk about that as well, or redeeming our moments. Redemption is taking a moment a happening or event, having been born from grief and pain and despair, and then helping that event to mean something more than simple failure or anguish or distress in which we just wallow away with no sense of clear direction, purpose, or pathway. To redeem a moment means that value is birthed from failure because it's fertilized by our new awareness of our shortcomings, cultivated by the practice of penitence while being actually watered by tears. Redeeming a moment is something that must happen so that we can, one, make amends for what has been, and number two, it forces us to act and behave differently the next time. As I said, penitence is a pathway to redemption, and it looks like this, especially for me. It starts with the acknowledgement of an unwashed truth. First, I recognize that something I have done could have been done better, or that I recognize that I've made a mistake. Secondly, I also know in this process that it's not what I should have done, nor is it how I want to see myself. And then it's a bold confession, even out loud to oneself first, then to God in the next breath, however you want to understand God or the wiser wisdom of this world, and saying, I screwed up. I'm sorry. Penitence is allowing oneself to feel and to know the heart of responsibility and the misery of the anguish when responsibility has been failed. And then it's looking to do something about it. Penitence makes one feel vulnerable and humble, which is difficult for many people and why many people avoid it, but it's only from these expressions that a new kind of life can spring. Then, when having made a confession to oneself and to God, it's then giving to others who have been affected, giving to others the same kind of confession, and saying from a heartfelt space, the soul, I'm sorry. I wish I had been better for you. And meaning it. And then with the apology to stop and to sit and to allow the wonder of compassion to be birthed from your soul. This is not who I want to be. It's not who I will be. I am no longer this person. I am no longer this church. And lastly, penitence is formalized in making the promise to risk being and doing differently than before. And from this day forward stating, I will be who I know I can and must be next time. Penitence is conscious. It comes from the heart, the soul, and passion, and a deep-seated need for personal wellness. It comes from the God-given capacity that we all have to express compassion, to love another human being sacrificially, without reservation and without expecting anything in return, no matter who they are and no matter what they have done. Through penitence, there is redemption of the prior moment, conferring upon it value and hope, and a desire to be the right kind of person, what God calls righteousness. Not too many months ago, I wrote to the parents of this young man who died. First, they knew that I gave them, they did, the best that I had for their funeral and for the grief work, because it's who I am. I'm a pastor. It's who I've been trained to be. I'd like to think it's intimate, but I wonder sometimes how superficial the routine can easily become. They also knew that I failed them with regard to their son, but they couldn't say anything. And so they carried that cultural stigma alone. And it was a stigma that they shouldn't have to carry alone or at all. I apologized for my and our congregation's ignorance and unintended, because it was unintended, insensitivity. I wish that we would have been with them in a different kind of way through those years. But the truth is, and honestly, we didn't know what to do. We didn't know how to do it, and we were afraid to ask. we are afraid to be embarrassed. I ask them to forgive me for what's unforgivable. And they were most gracious and continued to offer their presence in the life of the congregation as a symbol of their understanding, their forgiveness, and yet the hungry look on their faces just simply reminded me that I hadn't known what to do. And worst of all, I didn't ask. This is a sacred space. It's liminal. It's a place where you begin to experience something beyond yourself, where compassion and intimacy and truth and grace begins to grow. Sacred from the souls. And I'm aware this congregation and her people must do all they can never to put themselves in the same position because of our fears, our insecurities, our self-doubts, and it springs from that holy space. In fact, maybe this holy space is the impetus for courage, stepping forward, and becoming human in the future. In some ways, I'm not really sure what to offer you today except a building, a room, a confession, an opportunity to come together. Maybe we can learn and grow a little bit more. When we come into this room, especially for me, with a mother of a young man who died sitting very close at hand, I can only say that there is more, and we all know that or we wouldn't be here, that need to be done politically and economically and educationally and religiously and spiritually and communally. You're here. You've taken that step and have been, probably for you, you've been taking that step for quite a while. And maybe a space like this is just kind of a birthplace for opening it even just a little bit more. Because if there's any place and any people who need to step up and step in, it's the people who claim to be the people of God. I've come to know that we just might be the first line of help as many challenged people come to church for the very first time because they've tried everything else. Now let's give God a try. And sometimes you think about it and say, well, it's last resort, give God a try. Well, what about the first happening? But that doesn't happen. And it can't be an expectation. I know that we can't do it all, but we can stand fearlessly and give a best of ourselves to bring encouragement and love and compassion and presence, even sometimes in silence, because sometimes we just simply need to stand with people while the struggle is going on. We can provide a safe place for people to come with insurance. We can provide the reminder through our words and deeds that God is bigger and bolder and brighter than a simple throne sitter in the sky. That God is personal and intimate, cares, foundational. It's a God who whispers value into our souls even before our birth and never takes that value away ever. And God provides spiritual communities and neighborhood networks and professional services whereby that initial value, foundational value, is always to be affirmatively enhanced by people like us who are intended to be the best and the most vital expressions of God himself, whether you're religious or spiritual or not. So some reflections and a conclusion. Some things I've learned from this context. I've learned that we don't need to be afraid when we are overwhelmed by our insecurities and our self-doubt. Sometimes you just stop. Take a breath. Step in. We can be present. Sometimes to make ourselves present is not just to clear our breath, but to clear our minds. And you do that sometimes by saying a quick prayer. I'm one who doesn't believe there are atheists. When the pressure is on, people's first response always is a short little prayer that says, "Oh God." That's a prayer. We can also provide by listening intently. And we can even compassionately step into the anguish, not feeling sorry for anybody, is all too often the case, feeling sorry for walking away. Oh, well. But instead, standing boldly beside as if that son or daughter is our own, because the truth is, in God's eyes, he or she actually is. I found that there's enough fear in a family who is facing challenges that we don't have to use our fear to make excuses for ourselves and only make it worse for them. Our compassion can be lived explicitly as we immerse ourselves in friends and even strangers' challenges, helping in the places that help is most needed. I've also learned that when we don't know what to do, ask. When we don't know the right questions to ask, ask anyway. If we don't know, or if we don't want to ask because we don't want to embarrass ourselves or someone, ask anyhow. Because there's no embarrassment when it comes from the heart of compassion. There's only wisdom to be gained. And when we feel embarrassed, live with it. And then let go of it by saying that quiet prayer to God, asking for self-assurance and guidance. And you'll be amazed at how calming and reassurance that quick word can be. I guess I found also that they need to understand that any quick answer that we can give has already been tried. So suck it up and listen. Listening closely tells us how to respond and what to do next. And sometimes there's nothing to do but to sit quietly and wait and wonder and weep while we're listening. If there's an uncomfortable silence, sit with it. It's okay. It's necessary. It's needed. Because our presence speaks louder than any words we can say. And what I found in time, in this context and many others, God does his best work through us. And it comes most often from silence rather than our chaotic, frightened, frenetic minds, uttering all kinds of nonsense only to make ourselves feel better. Don't worry about making a mistake, because we will. But I also have come to learn if we don't make mistakes, we can't learn. We cannot help. We cannot grow. And we have no hope. But perhaps the most important thing that I've learned is when the overwhelming happens, is to step fully into the moment rather than to run from it, even though that might be our first instinct. And don't be afraid. Because holy moments happen when fear, by means of steadfastness, is turned to awe. I'll say it again. Holy moments happen when fear, by means of steadfastness, is turned to awe. And one last thought. When you don't know what to say, perhaps the easiest and the best thing to come from one's mouth is this: tell me. Tell me about your child. Tell me what you're feeling. Tell me what I can do. Tell me. Because I can. And I will. And I am here. Thanks for coming today, and God bless you.
Thank you, Rob. I would like to tell you that that is the reason why I come to this church, because I am the mother of that child. I cannot imagine being anywhere else where somebody would come to the front of this room and acknowledge that, and that is why I stay here. It is why I'm here every Sunday. It is why I love the people in this congregation and why I love this church.